The diner door gave a tired rattle as a man in worn clothes stepped inside, and the sound made a few heads lift with that quick glance people give when they want to judge without seeming to stare. The odd part was how the moment felt heavier than it should, as if something hidden had just entered with him. Those humming lights showed every crease on his jacket and every line carved into his face. And even before he reached an empty booth, the staff had already decided he was someone who would tip badly or not at all. A couple of servers shared that look of silent complaint, the kind meant to say they wished someone else had walked in. Yet the waitress, wiping down the counter, turned toward him with a warm smile that softened the whole place. She greeted him as if he were the first customer of a bright morning, and not a man dragging invisible weight behind him. He ordered the cheapest meal without hesitation, and something about that choice stirred whispers from a nearby table, low enough to pretend they were private but loud enough to sting. Still, he kept his head down, calm, almost studying the room, and while no one else tried to hide their annoyance, the waitress stayed kind. She straightened the salt shaker, placed a menu before him with both hands, and promised she would take good care of him. What no one knew was that the man who looked so defeated carried a fortune that could buy this entire strip of highway, yet here he sat, testing how people behaved when they believed someone had nothing to offer. And the way he watched her gentle smile suggested he had already found something he wasn't expecting. She came back with hot coffee, pouring it slowly, as if making sure he saw the respect in every small gesture. She asked if he needed cream, and when he shook his head, she stayed for a brief moment, checking if he was comfortable before stepping away. Her shift was filled with noise, plates clattering, orders being shouted across the kitchen, yet she returned to his table more than once, smoothing out the paper placemat, asking if his water needed a refill, and placing his simple meal before him with care usually reserved for expensive dinners. Her co-workers whispered again, annoyed that she spent so much attention on someone they believed gave none of it back. Their rolled eyes and tired sighs floated around her, but she ignored them, keeping her focus on treating him the way she treated everyone who walked in, rich or broke. The man watched quietly, noticing how her kindness wasn't forced, wasn't a performance, but part of who she was. It felt strange to him that a person with no reason to impress anyone showed more sincerity than people in his boardrooms who wore suits worth more than her monthly rent. Somewhere between her soft questions and the hot steam rising from the plate, he sensed a warm reminder of what he used to value before power made everything complicated, and the truth that he felt something shift inside him brought a quiet tension to the air, as if the smallest act of kindness was pulling him toward a memory he couldn't quite reach. Mark Ridley, the manager, walked over with that stiff body language meant to show authority, though it was clear his authority ended at the cash register. His voice carried irritation wrapped in fake politeness as he questioned why she was spending so much time on a customer who ordered almost nothing. Lila straightened her shoulders, cheeks flushing in embarrassment, but she did not step aside. She explained gently that every customer deserved good service, her calm tone clashing with the impatience dripping from Mark's voice. He pointed at other tables, muttering about profit and priorities, while Lila kept defending the simple truth that respect wasn't based on the size of an order. Each word made Ethan watch her more closely, and something deep in him reacted to the way she stood her ground, even when it risked her own comfort. She had no idea the man she was protecting had fired executives for less arrogance than Mark was showing, yet all she saw was someone who needed kindness on a quiet afternoon. The manager grumbled away, leaving tension in the air, and Ethan felt a rare mix of empathy and anger settle in his chest. For years he had sat across polished tables listening to people pretend to care, but here in this modest diner, he saw real courage in a place where no one thought it mattered, and that quiet strength in her eyes hit him harder than any negotiation he had ever walked into, pushing something inside him to wake up. He ate slowly, taking in every detail of how people treated one another, as if this diner were a small mirror of a much bigger world he had helped shape, without noticing how cold it had become. Lila kept moving around the room, carrying trays, wiping booths, and exchanging small smiles with customers who needed them. Meanwhile, the co-workers kept their distance from him, their sideways glances filled with silent judgment. Ethan thought about the dozens of places he owned, the thousands of employees who might be working under managers just like Mark, and the idea sent a tight ache through his chest. It felt strange to sit there looking like a man society ignored, seeing with painful clarity how quickly people measured worth by appearances. When he finished, he reached into his pocket and left a tip without wanting to draw attention. folding the bills under the edge of the check. Lila picked it up without noticing the amount because she had never been serving him for what he could give back. Her smile as she thanked him felt honest in a way he rarely experienced. As he stood to leave, something in him felt heavier but clearer, and the silence in his steps carried questions he wasn't ready to answer. Her kindness had stirred a memory of what he wanted his life to stand for, and the realization followed him out the door like a quiet shadow he couldn't shake. He walked down the road until a dark sedan appeared from behind the gas station, the driver stepping out to open the back door. Ethan paused before getting in, eyes drifting back to the diner's glowing windows, watching Lila move about unaware of the change she had awakened in him. That humble place had exposed cracks inside his empire, cracks he had ignored, thinking money and growth were enough to keep things running smoothly. He knew now that if managers in a small diner behaved this way, the same culture could be rotting unseen through his own companies. He slid into the seat, but before the door closed, he breathed out a decision that felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He would return. Not hidden behind worn clothes, not studying reactions from the shadows, but openly as himself to understand who Lila really was and why her small kindness had shaken him so deeply. The car pulled away, but his gaze stayed fixed on that little building until it disappeared behind a curve. That choice carried no turning back, and the faint tremor in his chest said everything. Something powerful had begun on that quiet afternoon, and whatever came next would change far more than the fate of a single diner. Before we keep going, pause the video for a second and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever met someone whose kindness surprised you. Go ahead and write it down now, because what happens next between Ethan and Lila only makes sense when we think about the people who change our days without even knowing it. All right, drop your comment, pause the video, and then come back so we can continue. Ethan kept returning to that little diner after the day Lila defended him, slipping in during slow hours when the place felt like a small world running on tired workers and strong coffee. He always wore the same worn jacket, the same calm expression, pretending to be just another customer passing through. Lila never treated him differently, and that alone pulled him back over and over. She moved with the same steady kindness each shift, checking on a table with noisy customers who complained about everything, then turning to him with a gentle smile that made the room feel less harsh. One afternoon, he noticed her stepping outside during a break, holding her phone close to her ear, her voice soft and full of worry as she talked to someone about medicine and appointments. He could hear enough to understand she was caring for a sick parent and trying to fit life into the cracks of her double shifts. When she returned inside, she wiped her eyes quickly, tied her apron, and went right back to work, as if she hadn't just carried a heavy moment alone behind the building. Her co-workers didn't see that part of her. They only muttered about her being too nice or wasting time checking on customers who ordered cheap meals. One server laughed as he passed Ethan's booth, saying something about how some folks think water refills are a full-time job, and Lila's jaw tightened as she stepped around him to bring Ethan another cup of coffee. Ethan admired how she handled disrespect with patience even when it stung. He watched her calmly tell a rude customer that she understood their frustration and would fix the order, even when the mistake wasn't hers. It amazed him how she didn't let bitterness settle in her eyes, no matter how many small insults were thrown her way. Every shift he learned something new about her, something that made him stand a little straighter and question how he had let his own world drift so far from these simple values. The admiration grew slowly, almost without him noticing. He realized he wasn't coming back just to observe the diner. He was trying to understand the quiet strength that made this woman stand out in a room full of people who had forgotten how to care. He found himself lingering longer, studying how she handled customers, how she stepped in to help co-workers even when they didn't treat her kindly, how she tried to end every shift with a smile, no matter how heavy the day had been. The more he watched, the more he saw how Lila's kindness wasn't weakness. It was choice. And it was steady, even when life around her wasn't. One evening, after she brought him a fresh pot of coffee without being asked, she gave him a look that held just a hint of curiosity, as if she wondered why he kept coming back without ever saying much. Ethan felt something inside him loosen, a sense that maybe she deserved to know a little more about the man who had been studying her world from behind tired eyes. He wasn't ready to reveal everything, not yet, but the idea of hiding completely didn't sit right anymore. Something about her honesty made him want to meet her halfway. As he stepped out into the cool air that night, he felt the decision forming. Before he even reached the sidewalk, he was going to show her a piece of the truth. Not everything, not the limousine waiting down the street, not the weight of the empire he carried, but enough to let her know that her small acts of dignity had fallen on someone who saw their worth. And standing there in the glow of the diner windows, he realized revealing even a part of himself might be the first step toward changing everything that had gone wrong in his own world. Ethan waited just beyond the glow of the diner windows, letting the last few cars roll past on the dark highway until the night settled into that hush that only comes after closing time. He stood near the edge of the lot, hands in his pockets, watching Lila lock the front door with the same tired but steady focus she had shown all day. She didn't see him at first, not until the soft purr of an engine approached and a long black limousine eased toward the curb with slow confidence. The headlights washed over the pavement, and Lila froze, her keys still in her hand, staring at the gleaming car that didn't belong anywhere near this old diner. Ethan stepped forward, letting the shadows fall away from him, and for a moment she looked at him like she wasn't sure if he was the same man who had ordered the cheapest thing on the menu or someone completely different. Her voice wavered slightly as she asked if everything was all right, and he nodded, giving her a gentle smile that held a truth he had been carrying quietly for days. He told her he needed to thank her properly, and that the only way to do that was to stop pretending to be someone he wasn't. Before she could ask what he meant, the driver stepped out and opened the back door, and the sight alone made her breath catch in her throat. Ethan didn't let the moment stretch too far. He spoke softly, explaining that his name wasn't just Ethan, but Ethan Cole, and the way her eyes widened told him the name landed with all the weight he expected. She covered her mouth, stunned, the pieces falling into place so fast she almost stepped back. She asked if she had done something wrong, if kindness had somehow crossed a line she couldn't see, and he shook his head immediately, telling her that what she did that afternoon had been the one bright spot in a day filled with disappointment and doubt. He told her that her voice had cut through the noise he lived in, that her honesty had made him feel seen for the first time in a long while. Lila blinked slowly, trying to understand how someone worth so much had been sitting in her section, quietly carrying the kind of hurt nobody noticed. His words softened her fear, though disbelief still flickered across her face, making her whisper that she didn't understand why someone like him would come back to talk to someone like her. He stepped closer, keeping his tone calm, saying he wasn't there to overwhelm her but to honor the impact of what she had done without even thinking twice. He told her that in his world, people rarely said things without expecting something in return, and that her kindness had been the first thing in a long time that felt real. She swallowed hard, looking at him with eyes full of questions she didn't know how to ask. He reassured her that he wasn't here to judge her or expose her to anything dangerous, that he simply wanted her to know the truth because she deserved honesty in return for the dignity she always showed others. There was a quiet moment between them, the kind where the air feels thick with meaning, and Lila finally nodded as if accepting that maybe the world was stranger and gentler than she believed. She told him she never treated anyone differently based on what they ordered or how they looked, that it never made sense to assume someone mattered less because they had less money. Ethan felt a warm ache rise in his chest, realizing how easily she lived by values he had forgotten to protect in his own company culture. Her simple words held more strength than half the policies he had signed in glossy conference rooms. That honesty lit something in him, a sense that the way she carried herself was a lesson he needed far more than she realized. Moments like this hit everyone differently, and that is what makes them powerful. Some people listening right now can think of someone who treated them with respect when they had nothing, while others remember a time when a stranger's kindness changed the direction of a whole day. When stories like this unfold, it reminds all of us that dignity doesn't depend on money, and sometimes the smallest gesture becomes a turning point for someone we don't even know. If anyone feels that connection right now, sharing your thoughts helps others feel less alone in what they've experienced too. Ethan took a breath and told her he hadn't come back just to reveal his name. He came back because her actions had pushed him to look at his own life differently, and he wanted to show that he meant it. Lila's fingers tightened around her keys as she listened, unsure where the conversation was heading. He told her he wasn't offering charity or pity. Instead, he wanted to open a door that matched the strength and honesty she carried every single day. He didn't say the full offer yet, not wanting to overwhelm her all at once, but he did tell her one thing clearly. He told her she had changed the course of his worst day, and now he wanted to change the course of hers. Lila stood silent in the cool night air, heart racing, knowing something unbelievable was coming next, but not yet knowing why it would be her of all people. The limousine door stayed open. The night stayed quiet, and the moment hung there waiting for its next step, one that would reshape both of their lives in ways neither could fully see yet. Ethan stayed there with the limousine door open between them, the quiet night holding its breath while Lila tried to understand why someone like him would seek someone like her. She held her keys tight, almost as if grounding herself, and finally asked what he wanted from her. His answer came slow, steady, as if he knew he had to place each word gently or they would break under their own weight. He told her he had been thinking for days about the way she handled people, about how she treated every customer with dignity, even when they gave nothing in return, and that he couldn't ignore what that meant. She shook her head lightly, almost in disbelief, but he continued, explaining that kindness wasn't just a habit for her, it was how she moved through the world. Then, with a breath that felt like the start of something huge, he told her he wanted to buy the diner. He wanted to save it from the culture that had allowed someone like Mark to thrive, and he wanted someone like her at the front of it, guiding it towards something better. At first she laughed softly, thinking he was exaggerating, but when she looked into his eyes and saw no hint of a joke, the smile faded. She told him she didn't understand why he believed she could manage a whole place, why he thought she deserved such responsibility, when all she did was show up, work hard, and try to treat people right. He told her that was exactly why. He said the diner didn't need someone with a fancy degree or years of corporate training. It needed someone who understood people, someone who cared enough to make others feel valued, even on their worst days. His voice softened as he added that leadership wasn't about titles, it was about the way someone's presence changed a room, and hers had changed his, without her even knowing it. She looked down, overwhelmed, her breath shaking, confused by the idea that the simplest thing she did every day could be seen as something extraordinary by a man who lived in a completely different world. She thought about her co-workers and how they would react, about the rumors they would start, about the way they already whispered behind her back when she showed a little too much patience. She said she worried they would think she had tried to get ahead by impressing a wealthy man, and her voice trembled with that fear because she had worked hard to keep her integrity in a place where people didn't always respect it. Ethan understood, without her needing to explain further. He told her he wasn't asking for a final answer that night, that something this meaningful shouldn't be rushed. He promised she wouldn't be alone in the transition, that he would give her training, support, and the right people to help her. But he made sure she knew the choice had to come from her and not from pressure or guilt. Moments like this have a way of echoing later, shaping things long after the conversation ends. The decision she faced might seem small to someone else, but the weight it carried would return with consequences no one could predict yet, and the path she chose now would eventually meet them again, in ways that would shift everything around her. Lila took a deep breath and nodded slowly, thanking him for believing in her more than she believed in herself. She said she needed time to think, not because she didn't appreciate the offer, but because it scared her how much her life could change if she said yes. Ethan smiled gently, telling her that fear didn't mean she wasn't ready. Sometimes it meant she was standing right in front of something important. She held his gaze for a long moment, seeing the sincerity he never showed inside the diner, and something softened between them, a mutual understanding built on respect rather than status. Still, uncertainty lingered in her eyes, and when she finally said goodnight, her steps toward her car carried both hope and a quiet storm building inside her. As she drove away, Ethan remained by the limousine, watching her taillights fade into the dark road. He knew the offer would shake the ground beneath her life, and he also knew the world inside that Dinah would not stay quiet once the truth leaked out. What he didn't see yet was how quickly those walls would start to shake, or how the people around her would react when they discovered the opportunity she never asked for, but somehow earned through the simple act of treating a stranger with dignity. And that reaction, already stirring in the shadows of the coming day, was ready to complicate everything before she even made her choice. The diner felt different that morning, as if the air itself carried whispers that scratched at the walls. Lila sensed it the moment she walked in. The usual hum was there, the clatter of pans, the buzzing lights, but underneath it ran a quiet tension, a kind of cold curiosity that followed her from the moment she hung up her coat. Jenna and Kyle stood near the coffee station, talking in low voices that stopped the second she approached. Their eyes slid over her with a mix of pity and sly judgment, and she tried to brush it off, telling herself she was imagining it. But the looks came again, sharper this time, and somewhere in her stomach a knot began to twist. She tied her apron tighter, hoping that work would drown out the strange feeling growing inside her chest, though she already sensed the day wouldn't let her escape so easily. It didn't take long before little comments slipped out. Jenna smirked when handing her the order tickets, saying she must be real proud of herself today. Kyle made a joke about fancy cars and teased that some people worked harder on their charm than their shifts. Lila kept her voice steady, telling them they were misunderstanding everything, but the words only fueled their smirks. The more she tried to focus on customers, the more she felt their eyes burning into her back, feeding some rumor she hadn't heard yet. When she stepped into the walk-in cooler to grab milk, she caught pieces of their conversation drifting in. The words rich man, special treatment, and a suggestion that she had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to impress someone with money. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they might hear it through the metal door. By the time she stepped out, Mark was already on the floor, jaw tight, eyes full of accusation. He motioned her over with a stiff finger, not even trying to hide his anger. She walked toward him, breath trembling, and he didn't wait for privacy. He raised his voice just enough for the room to hear, asking what she thought she was doing meeting wealthy customers after hours, throwing in the word seduce like it was candy he enjoyed handing out. The word hit her so hard, she froze. People turned in their seats, forks paused halfway to mouths, and every pair of eyes in the diner stabbed into her as Mark accused her of chasing promotions through flirtation and manipulation. Lila tried to explain, telling him he had everything wrong, that nothing happened the way he thought, but her voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. What Mark didn't know was that Ethan had walked in quietly just minutes earlier. He had taken a seat near the corner, unnoticed by the staff, and now he watched the scene unfold with growing anger. His hands clenched on his knees as he listened to Mark twist her kindness into something dirty, something she never would have done. He could see her eyes fill with tears. She tried to blink back, could hear the strain in her voice as she repeated, she hadn't done anything to deserve this. The memory of her worried phone calls, her patience with rude customers, her unwavering dignity, all of it collided with the sight of her being torn down in front of strangers. He rose slightly from his booth, ready to speak, but held himself back for a moment as he watched the pain ripple through her shoulders. He realized then that offering her the job hadn't just changed her life for good. It had also placed her right in the path of people who wanted to see her fall. The diner felt too loud and too quiet at the same time. Lila stood there trapped under the weight of shame, unable to defend herself without making everything worse. Mark's voice pressed harder, demanding answers she couldn't give without revealing Ethan's secret, and she felt her strength slipping, her breath shaking. Ethan took a step forward, no longer willing to let her stand alone, but before he reached her, she lowered her head and whispered that she needed a minute. She walked fast toward the back hallway, her steps uneven, her hands trembling. When she reached the employee bathroom, she leaned against the door, breathing hard, trying to hold herself together as angry tears fell. She whispered to herself that maybe she wasn't meant for anything bigger, that kindness only made her an easy target in a place where people didn't value it. Ethan stopped in the hallway, torn between giving her space and rushing to comfort her. He could still hear Mark talking loudly up front, spinning stories that made him clench his jaw even tighter. The truth settled heavy inside him. His offer had exposed her to people eager to twist anything they didn't understand. He knew now that whatever he did next would change everything, and that Lila stood at the edge of a decision that could break or rebuild her future. As he waited for her to steady herself, the hallway lights flickered softly above them, marking a moment that felt like the calm before something they could no longer avoid. The diner's hallway felt tight around Lila as she wiped her face with shaky hands, trying to calm the tremble in her breath. When she opened the door, Ethan was standing a few steps away, not too close, not demanding anything, just waiting with an expression that carried both worry and guilt. She walked past him without meeting his eyes, but he gently called her name, and something in his voice made her stop. She turned toward him slowly, her gaze tired and heavy. He apologized, telling her he never meant to put her in a position where people would attack her character. He said he should have thought about how quickly people twist good intentions when they don't understand them. She listened, and the hurt softened just a little because he looked as lost as she felt. She told him quietly that she didn't blame him for wanting to do something kind, but she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry the weight that came with it. Her voice cracked when she admitted she'd worked too hard to build a clean reputation to watch it fall apart over something she never even asked for. Ethan felt the words hit him like a sharp pull in his chest. He stared at the floor for a moment, wishing he could rewind everything and find a gentler way to offer her a better life. He told her he could back away completely if that would make things easier, that he didn't want his presence to cause damage. But she shook her head, saying it wasn't that simple. She had seen truth in his eyes the night he revealed who he was, and she had believed him when he told her kindness mattered. Yet now she feared that accepting his offer would only confirm the ugly rumors. She wondered aloud if stepping forward would make her lose the respect of people she still had to work with every day. The fear in her voice made Ethan realize how far the ripple of one moment had spread. He wanted to fix it, but the more he tried to find the right words, the more he understood that this wasn't a problem money could smooth out. A soft silence settled between them, the kind that comes when both people hold things they can't quite say. Ethan looked at her with eyes full of regret, and she saw how much the situation weighed on him too. She told him she appreciated every word he had shared with her, and that the offer came from a place of real gratitude, not charity. That alone meant something deep to her, even if she couldn't show it through the storm she was standing in. When she reached for the exit door, he stepped aside, letting her choose her space. She walked out into the cold air, hugging her arms around herself, and Ethan followed just far enough to see her under the streetlight. She whispered that maybe turning down the offer would be best for everyone, because she couldn't bear to be the reason people filled the diner with cruelty. The sadness in her voice made Ethan swallow hard, and he replied that her worth wasn't defined by those who misunderstood her, but he wouldn't force her into anything that hurt. Lila walked to her car slowly, head down, steps heavy. Ethan watched her through the glass as she sank into the driver's seat and rested her arms on the steering wheel. Her shoulders shook with a silent breath, as if she were letting go of something inside that had been holding on too tightly. She started the engine but didn't move yet, staring toward the empty road, wondering if her life was meant to stay exactly as it had been, working long hours, dealing with disrespect, caring for her parent alone, never dreaming too far beyond the diner walls. She thought about the offer, about the possibility of change, and about the fear sitting right beside it. She whispered to herself that people like her didn't get chances like that without paying some kind of price. Ethan stood there long after her car disappeared down the road. He leaned against the wall of the building, letting the night settle around him. He felt guilty for bringing trouble into her life, and guilty for stepping aside too quickly, unsure whether protecting her meant staying or leaving. He realized he needed time too, time to understand how to help without causing more harm. For the first time in a long while, he felt unsure of himself, and that uncertainty carried a kind of humility he wasn't used to. He walked back to the waiting car with a heavy step, thinking about her trembling voice and the strength she had shown even while braking. Moments like these make anyone wonder what the right path is. Should someone walk away from a chance because of fear, or fight for it even when others don't understand? If this were your life, would you take the offer or reject it to protect your peace? Share your thoughts. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And stay close, because this story still has a long road ahead. As the car pulled away, Ethan looked out the window at the diner lights fading in the distance and whispered that something had to change, something had to break or transform for either of them to move forward, and whatever came next would decide the shape of both their futures. Ethan woke the next morning with a heaviness lodged so deep in his chest that even the quiet of his penthouse couldn't soften it. He replayed Lila's trembling voice, her doubt, the way she'd driven off into the night looking smaller than she ever had. That image stayed with him long after the sun rose. By midday he knew he couldn't let things sit in silence, not with her hurting, not with a place like that diner shaping people with fear and disrespect. He told his driver to take him there. No disguise this time, no hiding. If his presence had stirred trouble by accident, then his presence needed to fix it openly. He arrived during the lunch rush, when the parking lot was full and the diner hummed with voices and clinking dishes. This time he stepped out of the limousine with no hesitation. Heads turned, conversations stuttered, forks paused mid-air. Ethan Cole, in a tailored jacket and unmistakable posture, walked straight through the door and into the center of every rumor that had been spreading since dawn. The room fell quiet the moment he entered. Lila was behind the counter, refilling coffee, and the mug nearly slipped from her hand when she saw him. Her eyes widened, not in excitement, but in fear that the situation was about to spin even further out of control. She hurried around the counter, whispering his name in a strained voice, telling him she was sorry she caused trouble, begging him not to make things worse. Ethan raised a hand gently, stopping her words before they could spill into panic. He told her she had nothing to apologize for, nothing. His voice was calm but carried the weight of someone who had already made a decision. The staff stiffened around them. Jenna set a stack of plates down too hard. Kyle froze halfway through wiping a table, and Mark, hearing the shift in the room, walked out from the back wearing a smile so forced it looked painful. He approached Ethan with his hand outstretched, pretending he had always known they would meet again. Mark tried to charm him with cheap compliments about the diner and its hard-working staff, as if he hadn't spent all week rolling his eyes at every customer who didn't tip like a millionaire. Ethan didn't take his hand. He didn't smile. He simply looked at Mark with the steady, direct expression of someone counting every lie he had ever heard. Mark's smile faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again, praising Lila loudly, claiming she was his best girl, a real treasure, someone he always defended. Lila's face tightened with disbelief. Ethan stepped forward and said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear, that he had been sitting in this very room while Mark insulted customers based on their clothes, mocked people who seemed poor, and belittled the one employee who showed dignity in every shift. A few customers gasped softly. Jenna and Kyle exchanged panicked looks. Mark denied it immediately, fumbling over excuses, blaming stress, blaming miscommunication, blaming anything except himself. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He calmly listed every moment he had watched from the corner booth, every cruel whisper, every public humiliation. Every time Mark dismissed Lila like she mattered less than the menu. The room grew so quiet the air felt thick. Mark's face turned red, then pale, then red again. Lila stood behind Ethan now, trembling not from fear, but from the shock of hearing someone powerful speak truth she had carried alone for so long. Ethan said he refused to stand by while the one person who made this place feel human was treated like disposable background. His tone sharpened as he added that people didn't become leaders by putting others down. They became leaders by lifting them up, by respecting them, by seeing the value in those who kept everything running. Think about this for a moment. If you saw someone being torn down while they were simply trying to do the right thing, would you step in even if it caused trouble? Or would you stay quiet to avoid conflict? Pause and answer this honestly in the comments. Your reflection on choices like this helps stories like these keep growing. Mark stuttered, insisting Ethan was mistaken, but the room had already shifted against him. Customers looked away from him with discomfort. His own staff avoided his eyes. Lila watched everything with tears forming, not from humiliation this time, but from the shock of someone finally standing up for her, the way she had stood up for others. Ethan turned to her and said she deserved better than the way this place had shaped her life. He told her she had shown him more about real leadership in one afternoon than some executives did in years. She covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the truth of it, and by the idea that someone finally saw her clearly. Still, even in that moment of vindication, Ethan saw the uncertainty in her eyes. He knew the offer he had made weighed on her more heavily now. Whether she accepted or rejected it would shape who she became and how she viewed herself. The diner wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a crossroads she didn't know how to cross. Ethan stepped back, giving her space but not stepping away entirely. He needed her to know he believed in her, even if she wasn't ready to believe in herself yet. The diner stayed silent long after his words faded, everyone waiting for something else to happen, something that felt just out of reach. As he walked toward the door, the tension clung to him like thick air. He knew he had pushed something into motion that couldn't be undone. Lila stood frozen near the counter, her thoughts spinning, her heart pulled between fear and the fragile beginning of hope. The next move, whatever it was, would decide everything, and the weight of that decision settled over the diner like a storm cloud ready to burst. Ethan had barely reached the doorway when the weight of the room pressed in behind him. Lila stood frozen near the counter, her breath unsteady, her eyes fixed on the spot where he'd confronted Mark moments earlier. The diner hadn't recovered from that shock. People whispered, shifting in their seats, unsure whether to look away or pretend nothing unusual had happened. Ethan paused with his hand on the doorframe, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he turned back, slowly, purposefully, and every voice in the diner fell silent again. There was something about the way he stepped forward this time that made even the hum of the lights feel quieter. He walked to the center of the room and addressed everyone, not in a loud tone, but with the kind of steady calm that makes people lean in. He said he was done letting truth hide in shadows. Mark tried to interrupt, insisting again that misunderstandings had happened, But Ethan lifted a hand and Mark's words shrank into nothing. Ethan explained that he didn't rely on rumors or assumptions. He relied on facts. He revealed that his visits to the diner had been observed through his team's security habits, the same routine checks used across all his businesses when safety concerns appeared. He made it clear that he had documentation of what he'd seen. The whispered insults, the disrespect, the way people treated customers based on how valuable they looked rather than how human they were. Gasps moved through the room. Jenna and Kyle froze, faces pale, eyes darting anywhere but at Lila. Mark's mouth opened in a stiff half-smile that died before it fully formed. Ethan then said one line that cut through the entire diner like a blade. She was the only one here who remembered that people matter even when no one is watching. Lila covered her lips with her hand, stunned. Kyle muttered something about everyone having a bad day, and Jenna stammered that they didn't know he was connected to anything big. Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly as he replied that basic respect shouldn't depend on who someone is or what they own. Mark tried to step in again, but Ethan turned toward him with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made a final decision. He told Mark his employment was terminated effective immediately. No raised voice, no anger, just a simple truth delivered in public daylight. Mark's face collapsed into disbelief, then fury, but there was nowhere for it to go. He stormed out the back door, slamming it so hard the windows shook, and for a moment the room breathed together, in that strange shared silence people feel when something unfair finally gets corrected. Some listeners out there know this feeling, the mix of relief, fear, change, and understanding all rising at once. Moments like this remind everyone that they are not alone in wanting workplaces, families, and communities where dignity counts. These turning points connect strangers who never even meet each other, all feeling the same truth inside their chest at the same time. Ethan turned toward Jenna and Kyle next. His tone didn't carry the finality he'd used with Mark. Instead, he told them they had a choice. They could keep their jobs, but only under strict training. Real accountability, real learning, real change. The room waited for their reaction, but neither dared push back. They nodded, swallowing hard, knowing this was their only chance. Lila watched, stunned that someone had finally drawn clear lines in a place where she had been walking on eggshells for years. Her hands trembled again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the shock of justice arriving faster than she ever believed possible. She felt something in her chest loosen, something she had kept locked away for too long. Ethan faced her last. He didn't speak loudly. He simply told her that none of this was her fault, and that the truth had only brought out what was hiding beneath the surface all along. Lila blinked through tears that didn't fall, trying to understand how the world had flipped in a single afternoon. He said he didn't want to pressure her into anything, not the offer, not the future, not decisions she wasn't ready to make. She nodded, still overwhelmed, and he added that his next move would depend on what felt right, not on power, not on pride, but on what brought healing instead of harm. As he walked toward the door again, the diner stayed silent. Everyone watched him the way people watch a storm that just passed, calm on the surface, but knowing another wave could come. Lila felt a faint rise of confidence stirring inside her, mixed with a deep uncertainty. Ethan had cleared the stage, but he hadn't revealed his final decision. She didn't know if he would still offer her the future he once imagined, or if he would step back for her sake. The air in the diner stayed thick with anticipation, hanging on whatever would come next, because everyone sensed that the biggest turn was still waiting just beyond the door he had not yet stepped through. Ethan stood in the doorway with the weight of the room behind him, but something in his posture changed. He wasn't leaving, not yet. He turned back toward the center of the diner, and the quiet that followed felt like the whole place was holding its breath. Lila watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, not sure if she should step forward or stay still. Jenna and Kyle stood off to the side, unsure whether to shrink or apologize or simply disappear. No one moved, and then Ethan took a few steps back into the room, slow and steady, as if he were placing himself exactly where the truth needed him to stand. He cleared his throat and said he had one more thing to announce. Every head lifted. Even the customers who had been pretending not to stare now leaned in with full attention. Ethan spoke plainly, almost gently, but his words carried a kind of weight that settled into every corner of the room. He told them he had finalized paperwork early that morning. The diner had been officially sold. Some people gasped, others whispered. Kyle nearly dropped the tray in his hands, and Lila stood frozen, unable to react at all. Ethan continued, saying he hadn't bought it to tear it apart or change everything overnight. He bought it because the place deserved someone who would run it with actual heart, not fear. Someone who could rebuild a culture that had been rotting quietly without anyone noticing. He turned toward Lila with a softness in his eyes that made her breath catch. In front of everyone, he said he wanted her to take the manager position again. This time not as a favor, not as a reward, not as some dramatic gesture. He wanted her because she had already been leading through her actions long before the title existed. He explained that the position came with full training, a fair salary, real benefits, and a profit-sharing system that would let her grow with the business instead of being trapped under it. A couple of customers clapped before catching themselves. Jenna and Kyle looked at Lila with a mixture of guilt and hard-earned respect. Mark was gone, but the shock he'd left behind was still thick in the air. Lila shook her head slowly, almost afraid to speak. She said she didn't know if she could do what he saw in her. She didn't know if she was strong enough to step into a role that big, not after everything that had happened. She told him she had never led anything in her life outside of a shift here and there when Mark wandered off. Ethan smiled, not dismissing her doubt but understanding it. He said leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice or the one with the title. It was about standing for something even when no one saw it. It was about serving people with dignity, about showing strength in quiet ways, about lifting others instead of stepping on them. He said she had done all of that without ever knowing anyone was watching. Lila looked around the diner, seeing people who had judged her minutes earlier, seeing the tables where she had poured coffee for months, seeing the place that had shaped so much of her life. Her hands trembled as she wondered how any of this had become possible. Ethan stepped closer and lowered his voice, telling her what he had never explained before. On the day he first walked in, he had been carrying the heaviest disappointment he had felt in years. He had lost trust in his own companies, in the people he worked with, in the way his empire was run. Sitting in that booth in worn clothes, he had wanted to see whether kindness still existed, when nobody thought it mattered, and she had shown him it did. She had treated him like a human being when others treated him like a burden. He told her that moment changed something in him. It reminded him of the values he had ignored for too long. It made him want to rebuild everything from the ground up. Her eyes grew glossy as she listened. The diner felt warm around them, not in temperature, but in something almost invisible, something like hope. Ethan kept going, telling her that the entire direction of his empire was about to shift because of a small kindness she probably didn't even remember in detail. He said he wanted her to grow, not shrink, to rise, not hide, and that he would give her every tool, every resource she needed to succeed. But the choice was hers, fully hers. Her breath hitched as if she were caught between who she had always been and who she might become. A moment like this hangs in the air in a way that makes the whole room feel suspended, as if time itself is waiting to see which way a single heart will turn. These turning points never end in the moment. They echo forward, shaping what is still unseen. And when someone stands right at the edge of change, the future often leans in, listening closely. Lila's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked at Ethan with gratitude, fear, wonder, and disbelief all tangled together. She understood the offer was more than a job. It was a doorway, a second chance, maybe even the first real chance she'd ever had. But she also knew accepting it meant stepping into a different life, and stepping out of the shadows she had once relied on to stay safe. Ethan waited, not rushing her, not pushing. He knew she needed space to breathe. The diner watched in complete silence. She whispered that she needed a moment, her voice soft and trembling. Ethan nodded, accepting that this crossroads was hers alone. She stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron out of nervous habit, then pressed her fingers against her lips, as if trying to hold in the storm of emotions charging through her. The room blurred around her for a second. She wasn't ready to say yes, but she wasn't ready to say no either. And Ethan, watching her, knew that whatever came next would decide everything for both of them, her future and his. Lila stood there with her hands pressed against her apron, trying to steady the shaking that wouldn't stop. The diner felt strangely quiet again, not because people weren't talking, but because every sound seemed far away, like her mind had stepped into a slower world. Ethan watched her with a patience that made the moment even heavier. He didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence, didn't try to sway her. He simply waited, letting her breathe. She could feel the heat in her chest, that mix of fear and hope fighting each other, pushing against her ribs. All her life she had been told to stay small, to be grateful for whatever little space she had. And now someone stood in front of her, offering a doorway out of that smallness, Not because he wanted something, not because she played a part, but because he had seen her heart when no one else had been looking. Her throat tightened. The room blurred. She lifted her eyes and met his, and in that second, something inside her softened and strengthened at the same time. She felt the tears before she felt the courage. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. Barely more than a whisper, but the whole diner heard it because the room was holding its breath. She said yes. At first it was soft, fragile, like she was testing the word to see if it belonged to her. Then she repeated it stronger, the sound filled with belief she didn't know she had until it left her lips. Ethan's shoulders relaxed just a little, as if he hadn't realized how deeply he'd been holding tension. Lila covered her mouth with her hands as tears slid down her cheeks, not from pain but from release, from finally feeling seen in a way that felt safe and real. The whole diner reacted before she had time to think. A few people started clapping, slow and unsure at first. Then others joined until it filled the room with soft applause that felt like a warm wave rising around her. Kyle clapped with guilt in his eyes. Jenna clapped with a small, sincere smile that admitted she had been wrong. Even customers who didn't know her personally clapped, because they had watched injustice break someone good and watched truth put the pieces back together. Ethan stepped closer and told her she didn't need to thank him, because this wasn't a gift. It was recognition. It was what she had earned by being the kind of person who made strangers feel human again. She shook her head gently, unable to hold back a quiet laugh that came from relief, disbelief, and new joy all tangled up. She told him she didn't know how to begin. He answered she already had by simply saying yes. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small folder. No dramatic pause, no showmanship, just quiet certainty. He opened it on the counter and revealed the official purchase papers he had signed that morning. Lila stared at them with wide eyes, realizing this wasn't a promise or a future plan. It was real. Signed. Done. He placed a pen beside the paper for her to add her signature as the new manager. The pen looked too heavy in her hands when she picked it up, her fingers trembling. She pressed it to the paper and wrote her name. When she finished, the room felt different, lighter, fuller, like something broken had been mended right in front of them. Ethan stepped back and let her absorb what she'd done. She took in the room again, but this time the looks weren't mocking or cold. They were warm, surprised, and in some faces even proud. It was the first time in a long time she felt the ground under her feet shift in her favor. She laid her hand flat on the counter for a moment to steady herself, her breath catching as she realized her life had just changed forever. She didn't feel small anymore. She didn't feel like she had to shrink or hide. She felt herself opening, expanding, stepping into a version of her life she never knew she could claim. Ethan watched that transformation with quiet awe. He whispered that she deserved every bit of this moment. She whispered back that she never thought anyone like him would believe in someone like her. Ethan shook his head softly and told her the truth, that her kindness had rebuilt something inside him too, something he didn't even know was broken. She pressed a hand over her heart, touched by a warmth that wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition, connection, the understanding that two lives had shifted because of one simple act. For a moment they stood there in the middle of the diner, neither speaking, both holding on to a silence that felt sacred. The applause faded into soft conversations. Someone wiped at their eyes discreetly. Even the lights seemed brighter, the air clearer. Lila took a slow breath and looked around her diner, and saw not the place where she survived shift after shift, but a place where she could finally grow. She turned back to Ethan with a steady, glowing expression that hadn't existed on her face an hour earlier. She thanked him quietly, but with a confidence she hadn't felt before, and Ethan, hearing the strength in her voice, knew the story was far from finished. Because yes, even though she had said yes, the weight of what came next, the responsibilities, the new world opening before her, all stood waiting just beyond the warm glow of that moment. And the future, bright as it suddenly looked, was about to test both of them in ways neither could fully see yet. Weeks passed, and the diner began to glow in ways no one had expected. Morning light stretched across cleaner tables, warmer smiles, and a staff that moved with a new kind of care. The place no longer felt tired. It felt awake. Lila walked through the doors each day with her hair pulled back and a calm confidence in her step, wearing a small name badge that read manager, but carrying something far bigger than a title. She listened to her team, coached them gently, corrected them firmly when needed, and showed by example the same dignity she had once handed out on her hardest shifts. People noticed. Customers came back not just for the food, but for the way the room felt different now, lighter, kinder. Even Jenna and Kyle changed, moving slower with judgment and quicker with respect, learning to unlearn the habits they had picked up under Mark's shadow. The diner started to feel like a place where anyone could sit down and breathe a little easier. Ethan kept his promise too. His companies began rolling out new training grounded in respect and humanity. He replaced cold manuals with workshops that told real stories, including the one that had changed him on that quiet afternoon. Executives who once ignored the smaller voices in the room now sat beside new hires, learning what leadership meant all over again. Ethan walked the halls with a sense of purpose that felt new in his bones, as if the dust had been cleaned from old corners of his heart. Whenever people asked what started the change, he never gave long speeches. He simply said that kindness, when real, is powerful enough to reshape anything, even an empire built over years. And he meant it. His world didn't feel empty anymore. It felt connected, grounded by a truth he had almost forgotten. Lila, between balancing schedules and learning the ropes of budgeting and inventory, sometimes paused at the edge of the counter and looked out at the diner during a rush. She would see smiles, conversations, people thanking her staff thanking each other, and she'd feel a warmth spread through her chest at the sight of her life blooming in places she never dared imagine. The nights that once left her exhausted and aching now left her proud and tired in a good way. Her parents' health stabilized slowly, and the relief showed in her lighter steps when she walked to her car after closing. She still doubted herself sometimes, still feared slipping or disappointing someone, but each day added proof that she was growing into the person Ethan had already seen. One quiet afternoon between lunch and dinner, she sat at her small office desk and typed a message to Ethan. Weeks had gone by filled with changes, challenges, victories, and moments that felt almost unreal. She read the message twice, then hit send. On the screen it said, "Your cheapest meal became the most expensive lesson." She didn't add anything else. The sentence felt true enough to stand alone. She smiled faintly, imagining him reading it, understanding exactly what she meant without needing more words. That message was not only a thank you, but a reflection of her own journey, a way of saying she finally understood the value hidden inside that first simple moment between them. Ethan received it while sitting in the back of his car, headed to yet another meeting shaped by the changes the diner had inspired. He read the sentence once, then again, and felt something warm spread across his chest. He asked his driver to make a quick stop. Minutes later, he walked into the diner without any disguise, just himself at ease for the first time in a long time. When he sat at the counter, Lila looked up from a conversation with Kyle and smiled in a way that made the whole place feel brighter. She poured him a cup of coffee, the same way she had on the day they met. Only now her hands didn't shake from worry or exhaustion. They shared a quiet moment, eyes meeting, both remembering how far this journey had carried them. Customers noticed him, but not with curiosity or fear. They noticed the easy way he laughed when Lila teased him about finally showing up at a decent hour instead of sneaking in. They noticed the respect between them, the quiet bond that had no need for big gestures or loud words. Ethan looked around, taking in every detail, and felt a deep peace settle in him. The diner no longer held the weight of old memories. It held the promise of what could grow when people looked at each other with kindness instead of judgment. It held his reminder of who he wanted to be, and it held the woman who had unknowingly opened that door for him. By the time he finished his coffee, the day felt steady and full. As he stood to leave, Lila touched his arm lightly and thanked him again, not for the chance he'd given her, but for seeing her when no one else had bothered to look. He smiled, telling her the truth she deserved to hear, that she had rewritten more than a diner, she had rewritten him. She didn't respond right away, only held his gaze with soft pride and gratitude. When he stepped out into the warm air and looked back through the window, she was already checking on a customer, steady, strong, growing into her new life with every breath. And for a moment, Ethan just stood there letting the view sink in, knowing some moments are meant to stay with a person forever. Before we close this story, think about one thing. If life handed you a chance like this, would you have the courage to step forward, or would the fear of what others might say hold you back? And which small act of kindness in your past changed something big in your world without you noticing at first? Pause for a second and share your thoughts in the comments. These stories only grow stronger when people open their hearts too. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you reach this point, Drop your first and last name in the comments so I know you're someone who listens with heart. Leave a like, subscribe, and stay with the channel so more stories like this one can come to life. And if this tale touched you because an act of kindness changed everything, then the next video will shake you even more because it dives into what happens when a long-hidden truth finally rises to the surface. Click on the next story and come with me. There's still so much to tell.